This is The Healthy Healer, where true voice is your medicine. This is where we help doctors and other healers navigate through the challenging times by learning from the best minds in the healing industry. Laugh, cry, and be surprised. It's entertainment, education, and inspiration so you can continue to be the unique and amazing healer you were destined to be. Welcome to humanity. Welcome to The Healthy Healer with Dr. Fred.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next exciting episode of The Healthy Healer. So today we have somebody who's halfway to Japan from where I am. He's living out in Hawaii, and really can't wait to have a wonderful conversation with Benedick Howard. Benedick has an amazing bio and an amazing history that must go along with that bio. And today you and I both are going to discover how this man became a healthy healer. What's been the route through this wonderful life of his that has led him to the personal trials and tribulations, strategies, tactics, tips, and tricks that he's learned over time that now leaves him as a self-proclaimed longevity coach. What is it, a longevity coach? What does that really look like? And maybe that's something we can all learn. When you look at the picture on the front of this particular podcast, you see a man that knows how to be his particular age as well, knows how to bend and not bust, and knows how to really help people reach their truest potential. So the opportunity exists for us today to meet my guest, my esteemed guest, Benedick Howard. Benedick, thanks for being on The Healthy Healer. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you, Dr. Fred. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that exuberant introduction.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was easy to read your bio, and then I fed it to my girlfriend in ChatGPT, and she actually sifted it out even a little bit more and gave me some ideas of questions to ask. But when I look at your bio, I have a couple questions that even precede her, believe it or not. I might even be able to step up next to a large language model and be smart enough to choose my own thoughts and feelings. What about that? Amazing, right?
I think that's the way to go, brah.
Yeah, let's do it. So, Benedick, first thing I like to ask all my guests is a simple, grammatically correct 3-word question that actually opens a door for everyone and seems to at least crack the ice a little bit. So here's what we got. It's 3 3-letter words. It's simple enough and sometimes can really be profound in its answer. And here we go. Benedick Howard, who are you?
That's a great question. Who am I?
Yeah.
I guess bottom line is my motto is do no harm.
Fascinating.
And in that, it's a huge responsibility and accountability too. And it has ramifications, and it has had ramifications in all of the research that I've been doing in health and longevity with sound and electrical healing, and more recently with the high altitude hiking here in Hawaii. At 72, yeah, I'm bendable. I do Ashtanga Yoga. I jog. I landscape. I still fit, but it's not without pain from time to time. And we'll get to talk about that and how we can monitor that and deal with that. But basically, who am I? I'm a 2 words, sacred scientist.
I love that. Very well put. And so tell us a little bit more about both of those words and then how they mesh up together. And then we'll talk a little bit about your history and maybe even your present aches, pains, and ailments that you think you have that are in the way of you living, or maybe just contribute to you living the full life you do as a human being 72 years old later. So talk to me about sacred scientist.
Okay, the sacred scientist to me was a label that was, back in 1987, I attended the last workshops of a Dr. Randall Baer. And he was heavily into the New Age movement with crystals but advanced crystal energetics. And what he had built was several, what he called unified energy fields, which are essentially pyramidal structures similar to the one that you see behind me here, which is actually a dodecahedron. And when I came across those different shapes, I was very drawn to the geometry of them, and being an engineer as the development engineer for General Electric, I'm
Ibrahim Karim, and we start looking at that and start looking at Bucky Fuller, some people who have also worked with these shapes and the power of either biogeometry or sacred geometry, how it applies to the world. I can't wait to hear more. And if either of those 2 names, I get that Rudolf Steiner is in your past as well. And I really wonder how some of these geniuses that were around in the 20th century might have contributed to who you become. And sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to bring those names in because I love name dropping when I know anything about whatever the topic is. So there you go.
Yeah, Rudolf Steiner had a huge influence on my life. I went to one of his schools in England and was very privileged to be there. However, I was clairvoyant and clairaudient at that time. It was later shut down and redeveloped it, but it was like I could see beyond and I could see through what was happening in actually the teachers that were our teachers. And instead of being that person and being that connection, they were parroting that person and parroting that connection. And it was a big disconnect for me, a big issue. And so, troubled child, I kicked up my fuss and got into trouble and got expelled from a Rudolf Steiner school, which I think is pretty unique.
That is awesome. That is so cool. You got kicked out of a Waldorf school, yes?
Yeah, because I was challenging the teachers really at the very basic levels of their understanding of what Steiner was attempting to train us in. And when I went to university, I wanted to become a doctor, but I could see through the whole doctor myth. And I was very suspicious of all the banking circles and all of the money stuff and all of the lack of abundance. And growing up in England, it was very closed down, very tight-lipped. And I was like out of place. But with the animals and the plants and looking at nature, I was very connected into that space. But it didn't really fit into what was happening out there as a late teenager that you saw happening in the world. The Beatles were coming on stream and et cetera, and all that great music back in the 60s, the 70s and 80s. And so I went the other way.
Throw in the 80s, by the way. That's for you to throw in the 80s. I appreciate that. I like the 60s and 70s. I feel like there was a dip in the early 80s, but I was deeply interested in the music in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it had a really special message, and I'm not that it wasn't a doctored message, and not that it wasn't pre-screened, but it had a very special message for us, and it gave us an identity that was like actually led us down a lot of paths over the decades, and that's a long story, but that led to me becoming an engineer with General Electric after I graduated in mining engineering. But the only thing I really liked about the mining engineering was one, the geology and the nature of ore deposits and where they were positioned on the planet. And two was the statistical work that happens in a lot of the geological assaying and how to look at ore deposits. And little did I know that this would take me down a road that how life is, it leads you down these paths. And over the decades, you can see these definite trends of the way that life has led you to understanding. And as you get clearer on what you want in your life and more bold in terms of asking for that and really owning what you want in your life with a clear vision of what it is in the future that you want to create, that is terrifying to begin with. But as you get more familiar with it, you see how it really works to beyond anything that's normal in the way that we think about manifestation and or about our lives. Normally, we're looking over our shoulders at the past and history, and we're going like, oh, history repeats itself. It doesn't need to repeat itself. And that's what I became really intrigued with, was like how we were looking at systems in terms of engineering, for instance, but later on, through those experiences of working with deep in many mines up in Canada as a development engineer, designing new products and taking them underground and being underground for sometimes days on end, really tapping into those deep telluric earth energy forces that are very apparent when you're deep down there in the dark and lonely too and cold and mysterious. But nonetheless, it gave me this taste, as it were, to and an appreciation of how we were bastardizing and raping Mother Earth in order to make steel or whatever it was, the metal that we were extracting, even uranium in some of the mines I went into. And what that led me to was like a recovery thing. It was like by 1983, I was like, I can't do this career thing. I thought I was going to be just a regular engineer and I was going to have a bungalow somewhere and a little family and blah, 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 blah. By the end of 83, I had quit engineering and I was on my way to Africa. And there I camped overland and stayed with different tribes for about 9 months in 1984. And that really changed my life. I saw for the first time how abundant cultures can be when they're not interfered with by the normal drives of, let's call it capitalism. For lack of a better word, we could call it other things too. But the next shiny object syndrome, where you're wanting the next shiny object, little thing, and blah, blah, blah. So it really takes us away from that consciousness and that appreciation of nature and how nature really provides for us when we take care of nature and take care of our gardens. And Africa showed that to me, because it was like all these smiling, happy faces around us whenever we got into a little village. And these kids were so frigging happy. And I'd never seen that happiness in my life before, genuine happiness.
Mhm.
And I was very deeply touched and moved by how disconnected my life was, or Western white life is, from that natural environment that I saw in the bush in Africa, especially in the desert or in the rainforest or in the mountains, or you name it. It was like so very different. And so I came back and it was like, okay, I'm going to do my inner development work. And I started with past life stuff, and I started working with crystals and aromas and all of that stuff. I'd been working with homeopathy for many years prior to that. In fact, I'd grown up with it, and herbalism. My mother was an herbalist. And I was really intrigued by how does it that this stuff is working? What is the juice that's really driving all of that life force in our body? And really, it took a very deep dive over many decades to really understand that, produce different research methods that I could examine that as well. And because of my engineering background, I had that ability to look at systems and really analyze systems, and to get better results, or to find out what was going on, or actually sometimes to create systems that we knew were going to break, but how they broke, we would discover maybe another passage, another clue, another pulse, another inspiration. I'm not much of a reader. I don't go back into books and look at stuff. I'm more of an intuitive guy. And so that kind of sets that person apart from the average person who goes to school and reads the book and grinds through stuff. But when I was in university, I did read, because they had all of Steiner's books in the stacks at Leeds University. And at that time, I got access to them, and I read every book that Steiner had written. And I was befuddled by the language. It seemed to be overly complicated for what was really going on. And it was unnecessarily complicated. And it showed me that there were other worlds and other realms and other stuff to it, but it was like wishy-washy. Even German language is such a precise language, but even that was like difficult to understand. And in the translations that I was reading, I never really knew how much the translator understood versus what the translator was actually unconsciously maybe putting into the translations.
Mhm.
And that led me down many paths, but basically coming out of the experience in Africa, that's when my life really changed. And in that change, I decided I didn't want to work for the corporate scene anymore. I would go and work as an individual, as my own contractor. And the other thing I did was I stopped paying taxes back in the mid-'80s.
Well,
And
there's supposedly there's only two things that are inevitable, and you just stopped doing one of them. How did that happen?
I had the balls to do it.
And,
Um,
and longevity coach probably attacks the other one. So we have these two things. So yeah, having the balls to stop paying taxes. Tell us more.
It was, yeah, basically, I'm not going to go into the whole legal harangue around that, but
No need
because
for that.
that's a deep dive. But basically, I stopped. And what I decided was that I was not going to make enough money that I would be even in a tax bracket. And so that really demanded that I found resources from other non-monetary sources. And what I found was that things would come to me naturally when I had that vision of what I wanted to create. And that actually really clarified that position for me back in the late 80s when I worked through this workbook by Shatki Gawain. Maybe you remember it. It was Creative Visualization. And it was one of these books that was like, she's saying that I deal with all of this stuff in the past and all my kids' stuff, blah, 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 all of that stuff in the past. But if I really got focused on what I wanted to create, then the world would mysteriously somehow support me and connived to support me in that vision. And the more I tested it, the more it became true. And at that time, I was amassing a bunch of real estate in Toronto, and I got to $1 million or whatever it was in gross worth. Yeah, gross worth, not net worth. And I decided that wasn't the world I wanted to be in. It's okay, you can go to 1 million, go 10 million, go 100 million, go 1,000 million. What's the point? And so I sold all of that and then took over the work of Dr. Randall Baer, who was Starcrest Academy, catch this one, of interdimensional law and science. And I took over his research after he basically became totally disillusioned with the New Age movement and flipped and ended up writing a book called The New Age Nightmare, A Sheep in Wolf's Clothing. Meanwhile, I'd inherited from him all of these really powerful pyramidal structures, some of which were Tesla coil activated. We had different shapes. We had different shapes for experiencing different types of conditions. And that led me to workshop these geometries around America and Canada, and then later into Europe in the late 80s, early 90s. And at that time, I was also intrigued by the aspect, of course, sound and its relationship to healing, and how sound would work. And I decided that I needed to create an environment that would balance. This is my dream, or this is what I put out to my dream for many months, was like, I want to create an environment that balances the body on all levels using sound, or actually cymatic sound, that's driven into the body energetically by the table that vibrates with the different rhythmic patterns in the music. What you feel is like a musical massage, but what's around you is actually this shape, and that shape has a very unique property, and it's very different from the old, I'm going to call it satanic black forces that are controlled through the pyramidal structures. And the difference being is that the pyramidal basically is the pyramid is basically a shape of integration and holding. It goes into a holding pattern. So it brings things together and then holds and locks them in. So whatever it is, the status quo, the intent that you're putting into that shape, that will help to lock it in, which is what has been used. This lock has been used to control humanity since 10,000 whatever years ago. And so I was like more intrigued by, okay, let's find a shape that is more liberating, but at the same time, these shapes are also antennas. They structure into the universe. They structure into the energy field around us. And in that structuring and in the way that structure is like a crystal, it's like all the work I did in the rock mining business. It was like I was looking at the crystalline structure of the rock and designing rock bits that would resonate with those structures in order to break them up into powder and slurry that could be drilled out of the hole. And it's the same reasoning that I took into this work with the sacred geometry. It was like watching and learning again how to watch auras, watching those energy fields of subjects in the workshop, and how those energy fields changed was like unbelievably mysterious and complicated, because it was dealt with not only the situation within the individual, his psycho, spiritual, blah, blah, whatever that print was going into it at that time and moment. And these shapes all interface with the energy field. And that's what was really interesting to me about the dodecahedron, is that it's a very gentle, nurturing shape, and it is the shape that corresponds to chi, to prana, if you use the Greek word for earth, Gaia, and that life force. It literally straps in and is an antenna into the etheric. Now, Rudolf Steiner talks about the dodecahedron a little bit, but he also talks about sound as being ether. And that always puzzled me for many years. I'd seen it as a normal physical model, which is the movement of atoms, air particles, and how they impinge on our body. And of course, you normally think about our eardrums and how that interfaces. But it was like more what is it that's really going on in that movement? Why is it that so many people are changed by music? What is it that we feel when we go into a cathedral and the energy and the proportions of that cathedral, how it affects it, and all of that math that's associated with that. And so when I created this, what it became called the DreamWeaver, dreamweaving.com, the environment was like so powerful. Because we were literally, instead of just hearing the music, we were now feeling the music. So where there were blocks in the body, that music would move to those areas and literally pulsate on those areas and start to break up that blockage. So that could be stress in the system. It could be stress in your thoughts, or it could be stress in the energy field out here. So when that pulsating, that parabolation that's going through the body, it nurtures and it parabolates, it loosens out this energy fields and starts to pop out of the body. Those blocks start to pop out of the body. Now, the environment of the dodecahedron is very special in that sense, because it's integrating and changing. It's integrating and changing. It's integrating and changing. It's always changing, integrate, change, integrate, change, integrate. Very different from the pyramid, which is like holding that status quo. And so you have a very different antenna system into these building blocks, these essential crystalline manifestation building block. So what happened was that when I started doing lots of sessions, thousands, and then when we did train facilitators, was tens of thousands of sessions. When I looked at that data, and being an engineer, I collect data. And so we did a lot of lecture scale stuff on the 1 to 10 scale. How's your physical pain, emotional pain, your environmental sensitivities, and there were a few others in there, but we were graphing out those qualities. And one of the things that was really complicated was, what is it in the psychological state that person is going into that session, and how that session changes that psychological state? And how do we measure very quickly that psychological state so it doesn't take hours of going through forms, et cetera, in the normal way that we look at it clinically? And what I was using then was a color test designed by Dr. Max Lucia back in the 40s. He sampled some 40,000 people. He used some basic, pretty dull colors, not interesting colors, but he mapped it against different psychological states. So we had a very quick way with a color card reading, very quick way of mapping out that condition that person was in going into the session. So based on what they had told me and what their colors were telling us too, we had a handshake, they were aware of it, or maybe they weren't aware of it. So it really designed two ways that we were going to go with the sessions. But all of this sort of evolved. Didn't happen overnight, these realizations. These evolved over many years. And still I am growing and learning more even 4 decades later. And so that sound healing work was, as a keynote speaker, I was like on these panels in sound healing conferences. But then I discovered this isn't the place I want to be. There were a lot of ego there. There were a lot of bullies there. And it was just not my type of cup of tea. It was just like, no, I am not going to play this game with you guys. So people have been watching me from the sides, and I was aware of that. And at times I got warnings about the work I was doing, and at times I got shut down because of the work I was doing, and my websites were all taken away. But it was like, at the same time, I felt that this work was so important that I kept going with it. And despite what was going on at that level, and saying, okay, if that happens, let's not focus on it. Let's focus on how we can accelerate that healing for people. Now, at that time, I was in a pretty, in my sense, where I am now, a very traditional mindset. Where I've changed in the last the last decade in particular, we'll get to, which evolved into a very different way of looking at systems. But as I continued to research with the sound work, it dawned on me, you may have a note, you may have an injury, say a scar tissue or a broken bone or whatever it might be. Let's just take something physical like that. And the person will feel it, like take somebody who's been like a motorbike racer. So they've had many breaks in their bodies over from the falls, right? And what will happen with them is there will be a cascade of releases from the injuries of those broken bones, almost to the same pain levels that they experienced when they were healing or when they had the accident or shortly after. And what would happen is that pain would burst loose and then everything would reorganize around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting. Now, if you use a note to do that, you're not going to get that result. If you use a pitch, say A, C, whatever, right? If you use a pitch to do that, you're not going to get that result. But with music, which has different rhythmic patterns that are growing and slowing down, or that are in tune, that are inspiring, and the bass line you're feeling ripple up and down because the cymatic pictures on the table are moving up and down, and you're feeling that area, and then it'll hit that point in the body, and then suddenly it's like it's coming up against it, and then suddenly that tension releases. The change in the state, change in breath, that person's going to another state. And that's when I would touch in with them again. How does it feel? Where are you going next? Yeah, let's get back focused onto where we want to travel with this journey.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And so that led to a lot of training with other facilitators. I asked them to do the color test because I wanted to keep their ego assessment out of the picture as much as we could. Of course, that's impossible, but they would have a different print on what was possible. And then these things, the DreamWeavers, I was building one a month and it was paying for child support, actually. And so that's how I went through life in the early 90s. I went through a divorce, blah, blah, blah. And that was very painful. And then we moved down to Florida. And then I took over Dr. Randall Bear's work. Yeah. I took over his academy. I did that work that I just described with the sacred geometry and a lot of flower essences and homeopathics and all of that sort of subtle energy work, right? What we'd call subtle energy work.
Absolutely. And really fantastic work. And the amalgamation or the accumulation, the integration of all of these aspects of what most people, or some people, I suppose, the general public might call alternative approaches that are actually healing in nature is extraordinary. And how you speak to your history is also extraordinary. We could go on for hours and maybe days in this conversation. What I'd really like you to do is maybe synopsize it at this point so that we can find out how our listeners, who by this point are completely intrigued and compelled by who you are, can get in touch with you and continue this conversation or learn about where you've been and where you're going. And then we'll open it up for how listeners can continue this conversation, continue to learn from you, continue to learn with the people that you learned with, or continue to explore with you all the things that are out here in the world of healing through these multiple different mechanical and spiritual and integrative tactics and techniques that you've developed and created for DreamWeavers, et cetera.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Yeah, I think what we'll do here is like, I alluded to how sound waves impact onto our eardrums predominantly is how we think of sound waves. But we're thinking about molecules moving, and what we forget and we think of that as just being a physical phenomenon. What we're forgetting is actually those molecules have an electromagnetic field associated with them. And that's the huge missing component in all of the sound healing work that's being talked about right now. The missing component is that when we have a moving particle, it doesn't matter what it is, always in that movement, an associated, literally an antenna into the etheric, into the dynamic that we normally think about as being electrical and magnetic. They can never be separated. The magnetism and electrical current always are. It's a handshake. It's like yin yang, and male female. Yeah, here we go. I'm writing a book, high attitude hiking Hawaiian monas. And basically that's my journey in the since 2019, where I'd go up onto these summits of Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea, or train myself to get up there in order to do prayer. And that's where my life really led to. But let me just finish this molecule thing, because it segues into the next piece, big piece, huge piece. So the electrical medicines were huge, and that was another 2-decade research, and we'll skip that for the moment. So basically the longevity model with the longevity coach was like, I was really interested in how to own my body and get my body super fit. I was already doing Ashtanga Yoga. I'd got through asthma and other stuff, and was also jogging. And so that led to a lot of different aspects. Fasting is huge. I do a lot of fasting and examining the body from a totally different perspective than I was originally going for. So in terms of synopsis, I guess the hiking became the journey. It was like how to mentally change my thought process so that I could get up to those altitudes and train myself to do it. And that took a lot of stamina. And that willpower, that strength and that willpower was something that I never knew that I had in me. It generated a completely different person. At that time, I'd also started to play a lot of music. I was playing ukulele and singing, and we do gatherings here every week, open mics here every week.
Mm-hmm.
And so where it went to now, and the synopsis that I can give you now, is that I need to take a breath. It's what I'm working towards now is exposing a lot of the myths around medicine and around electrical engineering, around scientism, and how scientism and statistics has been used against us, how infections and all of that virus stuff has been used against us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become my passion. So that's where I'm leading to. My website is benedickhoward.com. And that's the best place to get me. And I have a podcast called Fallacy and Idiocracy. And it's exposing the fallacies and the ruled by these idiots, and the fallaciousness in all of the sciences and all of the engineering and all of everything, maths, commerce. So I'd actually done a deep dive into the legal network for about 15 years.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, I think that probably locks us in to where I hope that answers your question, Fred.
Yeah, I don't want to necessarily lock us in. I really want to go with the dodecahedron rather than the pyramid approach. And what's here is I really wanted you to just open up what's here for you, because we could really go on for hours and maybe even days with this conversation. You're an extraordinary human being. That's very clear. What you've discovered for yourself on the back end, really challenging the status quo, and then creating and finding, and then stepping into, and then becoming the multiple different ways of managing what healing really is for us as humans, as a culture, as a civilization, as individuals, is extraordinary. Very clearly extraordinary. And what you've discovered and what you've created for others is also such a massive contribution, not only for your local network, but for all of humanity. And that is very clear. This is not in no ways any effort to either discount that or in any ways dismiss it. What's here, in fact, is the opportunity to explore and explode open the listener's capacity to get to you and to get to what you're up to after the podcast, because that's what the podcast is really meant to do, is spotlight your greatness and give people access to how they can play and be and run with. And that's what I think we're up to right now. So thank you for being you, and thank you for contributing such a high level to humanity in your really incessant exploration of what really works, what's not real, what is real, what you're willing to play with, what's aligned with your core values, and what's worth discovering and then sharing with others. So thank you so much for being that man. I really have appreciated deeply who you've become and how you got there. So the best place for people to find you is at your website. And another place it sounds like to find you would be in the Fallacy and Idiocracy podcast. And then there's your books as well, including the high attitude hiking. And I love the play on words there with attitude and altitude, and how you became someone who's 72 years old playing a game like you're in your 20s or 30s. So thank you for being you, Benedick. Fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Doctor. I really appreciate your time too.
All right. Thank you. And we'll catch you on the flip side. Listeners, if you enjoyed this as much as I did, please make sure you share it or comment on it. And if you can subscribe, that'd be wonderful as well. This is where we get to meet people like Benedick Howard. And there's a lot of people who might have benefited from meeting and listening to this incredible human being. And this is how they're going to get that access, is when you subscribe and when you share and comment in this podcast. That gives access to people who otherwise might not even have known anything we talked about. So thanks again, Mr. Howard. It's just been a deep pleasure, and I look forward to our contacts later in the future.
Mahalo, brother. It's been my pleasure. And thank you for your time and your great work too.
Thank you. Appreciate it, sir. Bye for now, everyone. We'll catch you on the flip side.